Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for listening to the Tuesday program today here of Point of View. In the first hour, we're going to obviously talk about what happened in Helsinki and talk a little bit about the relationship between the United States and Russia, the relationship between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. But I do want to move on eventually to some other topics this hour, if for no other reason than almost everybody's talking about the press conference, and we have posted 2 articles that you will find helpful in trying to make some sense out of what is taking place. But I also want to get your comments. Perhaps you have some thoughts. We have seen people say that this was disgraceful, it was shameful, it was a stumble. It's treason if you look at the New York Daily Times. So there are all sorts of reactions to this. And so we'll get into some of that. But at the same time, also would love to hear your comments. Perhaps you've had a chance to see some of the reaction. Dare I say, maybe in a few cases, overreaction to what many people believe is at least a stumble by the president when he was meeting with Vladimir Putin yesterday. So we'll get into some of that. And then a little bit later during the broadcast in the second hour, we have Karen Wheaton in studio. You may know her as a gospel music singer, but also just an incredible story called Watching the Road, which is kind of pulled from the idea of a prodigal child. Remember, again, the father was watching the road, waiting for his son to return. In this case, we're talking about her daughter. And just a really dynamic and incredible story, which we'll hear. And also just give some of you that maybe have prodigal sons or daughters a chance to join in the conversation as well. And in the third hour, which we broadcast on the national program, you don't have a chance to hear it locally, but certainly you can watch it online or listen to it online. We'll have Sebastian Traeger with us as we talk about The Gospel at Work. A book came out a number of years ago. They've updated it. And really, if you think about it, you just spend an enormous number of hours at work. And if you start doing the math, as I thought it was really interesting, the introduction by David Platt really kind of brought that home a little bit, because he was saying, if you indeed work 40 hours a week for 40 years, that means you will spend 80,000 hours at a job. And how does your Christian convictions align with some of that? So we'll have those conversations over the next couple of hours. And at any point, if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Some people say, well, I'm not really sure I want to get on the phone, wait for a while, and then ask a quick question or make a comment. So if you would like to do an alternative, one of the other things that we have provided is we not only broadcast, of course, on the program pointofview.net, which you can find, but also if you go to Facebook and go to the Facebook page for Point of View Radio Talk Show, what you will find is an opportunity to watch the program, listen to the program, but also leave a message. So if you want to leave a comment or a question about the performance of Donald Trump with Vladimir Putin, that is available as well. Well, let's start with one of the negative pieces that we have posted by Ben Shapiro. He said on Monday, President Trump gave a deeply disgraceful press conference with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. The presser began with Trump announcing that although the Russia-U.S. relationship has never been worse than it is now, all of that changed as of about 4 hours ago. Oh, yes. Ben Shapiro said it was downhill from there. Oh, yes, it was. Trump proceeded to state that he held both countries responsible for the deterioration of the relationship, then supported Putin's argument that Russia hadn't interfered in the American election in any way, and said, quote, it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it should be. I have confidence in both parties. Okay, we've got a lot to deal with there, but let me finish with Ben Shapiro for a minute. He says both parties, one party being a murderous dictator and the other the intelligence community that works for him. Now, again, you have to understand a little bit of this. I am not justifying at all, but okay, why would he even say this given the fact that he has at least two individuals I would believe he trusts, Dan Coates and Mike Pompeo, who are the two kind of key people in intelligence and the State Department. And so if they said that there was Russian interference, and then Mueller also has indicted some Russians, why didn't he just say, okay, they did, and Vladimir, you need to cut it out? I mean, that would have been, pretty simple. That's, probably what I would have said. It's probably what most people would have said. Why didn't he say that? Well, Ben Shapiro has one theory. I've got another. Let's get Ben Shapiro's first of all. He says, first of all, that what it shows is Trump's ego is one giant gaping wound. That's pretty awful. Constantly draining rage over the suggestion that his 2016 election victory was somehow ill-won, to the refusal of former FBI Director James Comey to publicly clear him in the collusion investigation. Also, then, of course, Trump, as you know, fired Comey. Now he's responding to the Mueller investigation indictment of 12 Russian government hackers by proclaiming that Putin might be innocent after all. This isn't about some nefarious plot. It's about Trump's ridiculous ego problem. And, of course, none of this acts as justification for Trump's behavior, of course, but it does explain why when Trump says stuff, it often doesn't matter. And he goes on to, which we'll talk about in the next segment, how in some respects, as we've said around this table, it's amazing how many times we've said this, especially on our Friday weekend edition with Kelly Shackelford. Don't look at what a person says, look at what they do. Because as Ben Shapiro will point out, and we'll get to that in just a minute, there is a disconnect so many times between what Donald Trump says, especially in those early morning Twitter posts, and actually what his administration does. There's a disconnect between sometimes things he says in the Oval Office and what his administration does, which is in many cases, as according to Ben Shapiro, and I think according to many of us around the table, in many cases is a real good thing. Here's another part of that. Ben Shapiro sort of alludes to it, but let me blow it out a little bit further. Later we'll be quoting from a piece by Mark Davis, who makes the same kind of case, and I've had a chance to hear Rush Limbaugh for just a minute. He's sort of saying the same thing, and that is, you've got to understand the circumstances that he's in. Again, not justifying it, as a matter of fact, just trying to explain it, not agreeing with it, but whatever. That we have right now a media that's been saying that there was collusion and that this was an election that was actually interfered with by the Russians. So there is a connection that is oftentimes made between Russian hacking and collusion with the Republicans, and collusion especially with the Trump campaign. These are separate issues. You could hack the campaign, you could hack the election, and not necessarily have the Trump campaign to collude. But again, that has been blurred so much that that's the case. Then, of course, you have the constant drumbeat that this is an individual that was elected because of hacking and because of collusion. And he wants to be able to say, I won fair and square. It wasn't the Russians. It wasn't collusion. I won because I outworked my opponent. I went to places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other places, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and I actually won it. And it just keeps him from being able to say, yes, there were hackers, but no, there wasn't any collusion. And no, it didn't make a difference as to whether I was elected. Of course, if he had said even that, which I think would be an honest statement, you know what would be the front pages of the newspapers. By contrast, what's the front page of the New York Daily News is treason. And a lot of posts are treason. And even people that might support him, like Fox News and Newt Gingrich, have some pretty critical things to say. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, more than 100 million American adults claim to have a biblical worldview, but actually a much smaller percentage of adults do. This is one of the striking conclusions of George Barna's survey with the American Culture and Faith Institute. It is important to know how many people have a biblical worldview because belief drives behavior, and it is important for George Barna to get an accurate baseline to use in future comparisons. His survey asked 20 questions about core spiritual beliefs and 20 questions assessing behavior. You were considered to have a strong biblical belief if you got at least 80% of the questions correct. Based on that, they concluded that 10% of American adults have a biblical worldview. This pales in comparison to the 46% of adults who claim to have a biblical worldview. When you look at the 20 questions assessing biblical behavior, you see similar trends. You were considered to have strong biblical behavior if you got 80% of the behavior questions correct. Based on that, they concluded that 18% of American adults have strong biblical behavior. The survey also identified what it called an integrated disciple. They are Christians who have the intention of being an imitator of Christ. They blend their beliefs and behaviors into a Christ-like lifestyle, and about 10% have strong biblical beliefs and behavior. This means that they correctly answered more than 80% of each category in the survey. One of the trends that match other surveys was the realization that the younger an adult is, the less likely they are to have a biblical worldview. Just 4% were integrated disciples, while much older adults were in the 16% range. The survey of core beliefs and behavior is one more reminder of the need for good Bible teaching and biblical discipleship. Obviously, we have much more work to do. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, one of the first articles we've posted here is by Ben Shapiro. A little bit later, we're going to get one by Rich Lowry, Trump's Helsinki Discord. But let me just finish the argument by Ben Shapiro, and that is, words don't necessarily mean a great deal. He said, more than a year ago, I wrote in these pages that Americans were beginning to tune Trump out. He said many Americans have been treating Trump as a guy to ignore except when he bothers them, an approach that seems pretty reasonable at the point. We've all had individuals that come up to us, and again, we sometimes, when we do these conferences, Tim Wildman came up with a phrase about some of these people that just bug you out all the time, and he calls them 1%ers. After we did some conferences, I came to Tim and I said, well, I think they're more like 10%ers, but nevertheless, I was just at a conference last week, and after every presentation, guy's got up his hand, asking a question, comes to my table, wants to talk to me over lunch, and okay, that's fine. And so in some respects, Donald Trump's kind of like that person. After a while, I just go, whatever, and it's sad. That's the president of the United States, and I don't think he's figured that out yet, and he probably needs some people to come to him and tell him so. But what he this goes on to say, Ben Shapiro, is that this is probably the case right now because when he tore into NATO, I think some of the NATO members said, well, whatever, and they just walked away and just said, that's just him. But the issue that Ben Shapiro says is sometimes words matter when they're backed by policy. And a good example of that is the issue of trade and tariffs, something we've talked about with great concern around the table. In other cases, of course, the words match up. In some cases, they don't. But I think it's kind of interesting that, if nothing else, he comes to the conclusion that the Trump administration's view about Russia, called criminology, is very different than the Obama administration's on that. And again, he says this is not kind of a defense of Donald Trump, but just an understanding of maybe why he said that, because what I've heard people asking me even as late as last night is, why didn't he just admit that his intelligence community, Dan Coates and Mike Pompeo and some of the others would be the ones that he would trust? And I don't know. That's just part of that issue. But let me quote from Mark Davis for just a minute. He's been on the program with us before because he was talking about some of the observations about his performance. And he said it's become a familiar rhythm for the president to do or say something only to be attacked reflexively by his harshest opponents. But the Monday festival of totally wrong-headed analysis ensnared even the occasionally sympathetic. As you might be picking up, Mark Davis is not as concerned about what the president said on Monday as some of his fellow conservatives. He said one could expect the bug-eyed calls for impeachment and the media course that Trump has somehow committed some grave offense against the American honor. But the triangulation necessary to understand this episode was apparently too much heavy lifting for even some occasional supporters. So he says, so I'll make it easy. If you were expecting Donald Trump to wag a finger at Putin at his lectern in Helsinki, throwing down an ultimatum to never, ever mess with our elections again, that was enormously foolish. Not because it would be undeserved, but because it would have sprouted more negatives than positives. He says, imagine for a moment that the president had Putin, told Putin, for example, where to stuff that souvenir World Cup soccer ball. The media would have briefly approved, critics would have issued momentary grudging appreciation, and John Brennan might have put down his voodoo dog. John Brennan is the one that called for this individual to be impeached because he is actually now past high crimes and misdemeanors, but we'll leave that for another day. And he said, meanwhile, the layer of ice that would have encased the relationship would shut the door on things Trump actually wants to achieve, goals a little more lasting than kicking Putin in the shins in the public. He would like to cooperate with Russia in fighting ISIS. He would like to loosen the buddy relationship with Assad in Syria. He might even seek to wheedle Russian exit from Crimea. And being Donald Trump, he would surely like to see if there are trade deals to be gleaned from that improved relationship. One might suggest that those are noble, but wouldn't he also like to dissuade Russia from launching cyber attacks into our political process? I'm sure he would. He may well have made that clear behind closed doors after the Finnish cuisine, but let's spend a moment examining the source of all of this sudden hand-wringing. How many people condemning Trump for coddling Putin raised the slightest eyebrow at Barack Obama's open-mic wink to the Russians that he would be more flexible after the 2012 election? And how many of those sudden warriors for election purity are on the record fighting for voter ID and other laws which would protect us from real-life threats of illegal voting? From the shrill retorts Monday afternoon, you would think Trump had delivered our nuclear codes to them. The main thrust of the vilifications were he should really be tough on bad countries, and Russia is a really bad country. Fair points, but please, we're downright chummy with China, the largest, most evil remaining communist dictatorship on the planet. And it's not as though Obama laid down an 8-year legacy of toughness towards Russia or anyone else. The opportunistic gaps in Trump's comments are born of a different passion, profound distaste for him. And it goes on to deal with some of those other issues, but I just thought it would give you a different perspective. Nevertheless, there is some damage to be fixed, and probably the most significant tweet, which interestingly enough was reprinted in the New York Times. How many times has the New York Times, first of all, reprinted a tweet in its editorial page, and especially when the tweet's from Newt Gingrich? So that tells you a lot. But Newt Gingrich sent out a tweet yesterday saying President Trump must clarify his statements in Helsinki on our intelligence system and Putin. It is the most serious mistake of his presidency and must be corrected immediately. So on this particular case, not only did they find themselves in agreement with Newt Gingrich, but in something I don't see very often in the New York Times, they actually reprinted in its entirety the tweet from Newt Gingrich. So there is some work to be done, and no doubt about that. It's certainly one that will have to be addressed over the next couple of weeks by the president, and probably a need for someone to sit down with him, which is kind of the argument that Rich Lowry makes in a piece that we've also posted. because he said Donald Trump is not and never will be the Moscow correspondent for The Nation magazine, and he shouldn't sound like it. Nation, by the way, being a very liberal, progressive magazine. The left-wing publication is prone to extend sympathetic understanding to adversaries to the United States and find some reason, any reason, to blame ourselves for the external aggression and internal suppression, especially to the regime of Vladimir Putin, which was supposedly forced into its brute force citicism by the encirclement by the West. This is an old comment going back to the Cold War, used as an excuse every time Moscow tramples on a neighbor and lies about it. This rationalization of Russian adventurism is bad enough when it is trotted out by opinion leaders, both on the Blame America First left and on the Buchananite right. That's James Buchanan as well, Pat Buchanan, I should say. But even worse when it passes the lips of a president of the United States. Trump is extremely defensive about Russia's meddling in the 2016 election, which he believes is being used to undermine the legitimacy of his victory. Back to the point I made just a minute ago. Thus, he resorts to sophistry, blame shifting, obfuscation to avoid fully confronting the fact that he did this standing next to the foreign perpetrator of the crime in Helsinki was depressing, if not surprising. But more startling was Trump's statements blaming both the United States and Russia for poor relations. We just talked about that a minute ago. He tweeted before the meeting with Putin and then confirmed the point when pressed about it in the news conference. I hold both countries responsible. And at this point, you can kind of get the sense that what we are talking about here with Richard Lowry bothers him a little bit, because he says, yes, both countries. One is given to invading its neighbors, rigging elections, killing dissidents, including on foreign soil, and violating international agreements and norms in the hopes of reestablishing something like the old Russian Empire. The other has a strange but apparently unbreakable habit of electing new presidents who naively believe that they can reset relations with Russia based on their personality and goodwill. By the way, that goes all the way back at least to George W. Bush, probably further, but we'll just take those in the last 2 centuries here. And George W. Bush said, I looked into the soul of Putin. And then, of course, you have the reset button of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And it is, I think, a sad commentary that Vladimir Putin's been in power all those times. And every time we seem to elect a president that is convinced that with the sheer force of their will and personality, they're going to change what the Russian dictator, who used to be part of the KGB, is going to change because of it. And so I think we need to look with a clearer eye at what is happening in the world, and at the same time make sure that we, as believers, are praying for the president, pray for the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who I suspect is probably having a very good chat today with the president about some of the things that were said, and with some of the other people in his cabinet. But we need to take a break. By the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read some of these articles, one by Ben Shapiro, one by Rich Lowry, and some others that we can certainly post if you're interested, those are available at the website pointofview.net. If you'd like to leave a note and a comment or a question about the performance in Helsinki, also you can go to the Facebook page where we are broadcasting as well. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
And once again, let me, for just a few minutes, if I could, focus our time and attention somewhere else. There are so many times when these kinds of stories dominate the headlines. And I understand that for some time, of course, the trip that Donald Trump took to first NATO and the G7 and then to Helsinki and meeting with Vladimir Putin, by definition, almost has to dominate the headlines. But for the last couple of weeks, there is a story that deserves front page attention, and it isn't receiving it, and I'll explain why in just a minute. And that is what it is like right now to live as a Christian in Nigeria. We, if those of us are a little bit older, remember back in the mid-1990s that we had a genocide that took place in Rwanda. I'm talking about 1 million Tutsi tribe people were killed. And we have something very similar happening in Africa. And you might even remember when there was concern about what was happening in Darfur. And the good news is lots of individuals in Hollywood and others stepped up to speak about that. Well, right now, many people are saying that the most dangerous place in the world to be a Christian is in the country of Nigeria. And the phrase that's oftentimes used to explain what is happening is that it's pure genocide. Now, I'm going to do the work that the mainstream media should be doing, but isn't. Nigeria is a country that's really divided. In the northern part of the country, it is predominantly Muslim. And the south has a number more Christians. There's sort of a middle section there. And what you have right now is an attempt, as Open Doors has said, to basically have a religious cleansing. It's an attempt by the Muslims, especially in the north, but also in other parts of Nigeria, to just kill every Christian possible. And so in the past, the greatest threat to Christians in Nigeria has been from Boko Haram. But now a greater threat has come from a radical group called Fulani herdsmen. And they have murdered at least 6,000 children and murdered them because they are Christian. Now, the media has really ignored this. I will give credit in just a few minutes to some places that have focused on this, but this has been something that has been ignored, even though it's perhaps the greatest human rights tragedy of our day. And in some cases, maybe, for example, as a land conflict between different groups. But the Christian leaders there say this has nothing to do with farmers versus herdsmen clash, because what it is it's a target on Christians. Now, one of the individuals I'd like to get on the program sometime in the future here is Raymond Ibrahim. He says that Christians are the most persecuted people on earth. And for those of you that have access to a computer, I would really encourage you to go to the YouTube video. It's actually a Prager University video, which he's done, which talks about this idea. Also, he's written about this in Jihad Watch. And he's got kind of a theory. Why is it whenever we have Christians being persecuted, not just in Nigeria, because look at the persecution of Christians in Egypt and in most of these other Muslim countries. Whenever we've done an interview with somebody from Open Doors, we point out that the top 10 countries where there's the greatest persecution, number one is North Korea, but the other 9 are Muslim countries, and that's understandable because of the fact that there is a desire on the part of these radical groups to completely eliminate Christians from the world and from their particular country. And even if they do not kill them, some of them remain, but certainly they have to live in what's called dhimmi status, in dhimmitude. And so anyway, Raymond Ibrahim has done some good work in which he's tried to explain, well, why is it the mainstream media doesn't cover this? And it kind of gets back to a comment we just made a minute ago by Rich Lowry. The liberal view has always been that the reason Russia reacts is because it's encircled. But the liberal view has also been that the reason Muslims are reacting is because of colonial imperialism. And so whenever you see a reaction from radical Muslims, Muslim terrorists, it's, well, they're reacting against the West. But this doesn't fit the narrative, because what you have here is Muslim groups persecuting a small minority of Christians. And so it doesn't fit what's called the narrative. Now, there's another reason for that, and that is if you attack Muslims just verbally, talk about them, criticize them, point it out, you itself could be attacked. And even attempts more recently, as I've seen from some of our colleagues, individuals we've interviewed on this program and others, that when they've tried to educate the Christian public with posts that have been in Jihad Watch or Christian Post or Breitbart News or in Twitter or Facebook or whatever, they are almost always met with a very violent backlash from Muslim apologists. They don't want that information coming out. So this is a story that I'm not going to spend much more time talking about. I've got a commentary coming out next week on this. But we can be encouraged that the Nigerian president, when he was here in April with President Donald Trump, both of them did speak out on the issue. We can give credit to the fact that Jihad Watch and Christian Post and Breitbart News and even Breakpoint Commentary had something on this recently, has spoken to this issue. But it's just a reminder that while we are focused on some discord in Helsinki or even discord at home, there's a bigger story. And if nothing else, as Christians, I hope that you will pray for not only these leaders, but pray for these persecuted Christians around the world, and especially in the country of Nigeria. Let me come back to the reaction, of course, to the Helsinki discord, as Rich Lowry called it. And it brings me back to a piece we posted yesterday by Derek Hunter called "Liberal Outrage is All the Rage." And he starts out by saying that one of the things you always have people ask is, why doesn't Saturday Night Live do some skits or make some fun of liberals? And to be fair, they have occasionally. But what he argues, I think it's a great line, is when they are making such outrageous statements that it's almost hard, almost really difficult to parody a parody. Their reactions are almost a parody themselves. And he talks about all sorts of examples, but probably the best is to see right now the reaction from kind of what I call the big five. The five individuals who look like they're going to be as Democratic nominees for the Democratic Party in 2020 for the presidency. And so they have found ways to call for all sorts of things, including, of course, the impeachment of Donald Trump, and even the calling for people to whole-scale resign from his administration. But they also are the ones that have called for a single-payer plan, basically socialized medicine. They've called for the complete abolition of ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They've called for a universal guaranteed income for all individuals. And the list just goes on and on and on of all the things that they are calling for. And what is so interesting in the piece by Derek Hunter is simply that the Democratic Party has become fringe. Whereas before you had some sort of moderate individuals, and now the question is being asked, would a Bill Clinton even be nominated by the current Democratic Party? Would a John F. Kennedy be nominated by the current Democratic Party? And I think the answer for that is no. What even used to be somewhat of a fringe position by Bernie Sanders, who's one of the big five. By the way, if you want to know who the five are, it's Bernie Sanders, it's Elizabeth Warren, it's Cory Booker, it's Joe Biden. Yes, Joe Biden's thinking of running again, and it's Kamala Harris. So you've got a number of senators, Bernie Sanders, of course, from Vermont, Cory Booker from New Jersey, Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, Kamala Harris from California, Joe Biden, of course, previous vice president, but also before that, senator from Delaware. So you have five senators or former senators that believe that they are going to be the next president of the United States. And what has been so interesting is what before was sort of a fringe idea, that is, single-payer plan. Bernie Sanders refashioned it to call it, what's he call it now? It's a Medicare for all. But realistically, if you look what he's calling for, it's really the Veterans Administration, the VA for all, because it would have the government taking over all sorts of aspects in order to achieve any kind of health care cost constraining and things of that nature. Whereas before, he was sort of the outlier. Now, every one of those other four, and now all five of them, hold to that idea of Medicare for all. Essentially, all of them want to abolish ICE, immigration and customs enforcement. All of them want to have at least a guaranteed minimum wage of $15 an hour. Every one of them also want to have universal guaranteed income. All of them want to have free college. No question about how they're going to answer any of that, but nevertheless, or how they're going to pay for all of it. It just, again, is just an illustration of how, in some respects, the whole Democratic Party has become so much more radical and so much more progressive and liberal than it was just since the last election, and certainly since the last two elections. Pretty interesting. Come back and talk about one other aspect that is surfacing in that regard right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee has signed into law a measure protecting the religious liberty of Tennessee's student athletes. The new law allows parents to opt their students out of participation in an athletic contest if the event is on an official school holiday, observed day of worship, or religious holiday. Moreover, it sets the authority aright by explaining that school officials may not require a student to attend an athletic event over the parent's objection. Some wonder how necessary such a measure is. They argue that schools already respect the religious choices of student athletes and do not punish those students who, for religious reasons, sit out of scheduled contests. That, I suppose, is a debate for the ages. Whether athletes should participate on holy days is not a new issue. Just watch the classic movie Chariots of Fire as but one example. Nonetheless, it is good to see the state of Tennessee explicitly stating that its school districts should be mindful that there are things to be respected of higher importance than sports. Athletics can teach students much about life, diligence, and teamwork, but life balance is a critical element taught by sports in school as well. Today's student athletes are tomorrow's business leaders who may be required to accommodate the religious practices of employees. Let us hope they learn the delicate balance of freedom well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me mention again, we'll have Karen Wheaton in studio with us in the next hour as we talk about watching the road, praying for your prodigal home, and it's going to be a great opportunity for you to hear her story, and I'd love to hear yours as well if you have a prodigal in your house. But let me, before we wind down here, also talk about how some of this is affecting the campaign. Of course, I mentioned the 5 individuals who, at the moment, are sort of the odds-on favorite to be one of the Democratic nominees for the presidency. And they 5 issues, single-payer medical and college, free college, as well as guaranteed basic income, abolishing ICE, and $15 an hour. But one of the other things that has surfaced is just the willingness on the part of especially these Democratic nominees to call anyone they disagree with, especially Donald Trump, a Nazi. And one of the things that I have as a commentary coming out next week is to go back and recognize that this isn't a new phenomenon. You can go all the way back to 1948 when Harry Truman claimed that his Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey, was a front man for fascists. During the 1964 presidential campaign, you had the governor of California, Edmund Brown, who suggested that the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater had the stench of fascism. Interesting enough, 2 years later, a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan replaced Edmund Brown as governor of California. And really, if you start looking at all the different times in which Ronald Reagan, first as governor and then as president, was called a Nazi, I don't think you could even count them all. Since then, of course, the Nazi label has been given to George W. Bush and, more importantly, probably than anything else, Donald Trump. And I think the purpose in the past, of course, has always been that by calling somebody a fascist or a Nazi or a radical, what you ended up doing was intimidating them and backing them off of their particular view. And sometimes, frankly, it really did tend to work. But the bottom line is that Donald Trump and a lot of his supporters don't seem to really care that much that you call them that. And because the N-word, the Nazi word, has been used so much now, it almost doesn't have the kind of meaning or impact that it used to have. So this has put, a lot of the individuals, not only these presidential candidates, but their supporters, in a difficult situation. Because if this is, then guess what? It's going to just bounce off some of these candidates, and it doesn't seem to have any effect at all on Donald Trump and some of the supporters. And it's just name-calling, and it's probably a good example of the fact they really don't believe their words in the first place. But if they really do believe that, and the sad reality is more and more individuals, because of just the unbelievable reaction, sometimes the inability to get the Trump supporters and Donald Trump to back off of some of the agenda, they, I think, really do believe that America is just like Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Well, again, think that through. If you are convinced that we are in the midst of the greatest evil possible, this is a need for us to fight evil incarnate, then it just about justifies all sorts of actions, and I think maybe explains some of the speeches we've seen, some of the actions by members of Congress, not only from those in Congress, but some of their supporters, and just an illustration of what we might be in for. But, of course, this is going to show up one other place as well, and that is to the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh. Cory Booker, one of the people I mentioned just a minute ago, tweeted, "Our next justice should be a champion for protecting and advancing rights, not rolling them back. But Kavanaugh has a long history of demonstrating hostility towards defending the rights of everyday Americans." First of all, that's not true. But second of all, if indeed he believes that, then he's going to certainly not only believe that he should vote against Brett Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh, but that he needs to do all he can to vilify him, especially if he wants to guarantee that he becomes the odds-on nominee for the presidency. Okay, let's go to Bernie Sanders, one of the other big five. He tweeted, "If Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, it will have a profoundly negative effect on workers' rights, women's rights, and voter rights for decades to come. We must do everything we can to stop this nomination." I don't like the phrase, do everything we can, because when you have a rather unhinged group of individuals that support you, everything or anything we can do is certainly going to be a problem. Let me pick another one in the interest of time here. On MSNBC, Senator Elizabeth Warren said people storming into the streets and making their voices heard about Kavanaugh is the remarkable part of a democracy. Actually, it's not. What it is getting really close to something that looks a little bit like anarchy, and just an illustration, again, of what is happening here, even when we get to something as simple as the decision to put Judge Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court to replace Anthony Kennedy. I can't imagine it getting any worse unless Ruth Bader Ginsburg would step down or die, because you can even see that as a greater threat, perhaps, to the liberal progressives out there. And it's just an illustration, again, that we are probably not only headed for a continually warm summer in terms of temperature, but a really hot fall when indeed these confirmation hearings surface. And as you begin to see some of the questions being asked by these individuals, 4 of whom still are sitting senators and thus have the right to ask some of those questions, either in the committee meeting, some are in the committee, some are not, or on the floor, I think you're going to see a level of liberal outrage that you've never seen before, because as I pointed out, all 5 of these individuals are convinced that they are the next Democratic candidate to run against Donald Trump. And so they can justify referring to Donald Trump or anyone that supports him as being a Nazi. They can support doing anything they can to block the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh. And at the same time, they've called for everything from abolition of ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to having a universal or guaranteed basic income for all, free college, as well as a single-payer plan. And let's get that minimum wage up to $15 an hour, because that's worked so well up there in Seattle and some of the other places where it's been implemented. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of how this has played out. Obviously, some of the concerns about what Donald Trump said yesterday in Helsinki are justified, but the overreaction illustrates the fact that even though we're right now in the midterm elections, you have a number of individuals that, first of all, are convinced that these statements made by the president and his latest appointment of Judge Kavanaugh are going to be the end of the republic as we know it. And so that's going to continue to be front page news for quite some time. If you'd like to read some of these issues and topics and articles, they're all available at the website, pointofview.net. I might just mention that in 2 cases here, I mentioned commentaries that will be out next week in part of my Viewpoints commentaries. My Viewpoints commentary today is on a biblical worldview survey, which is one that helps us understand how we as Christians really need to do all we can to educate everybody to have a biblical worldview, and how we in the believing community needs to have a biblical worldview. But if you have not already signed up to receive my Viewpoints commentary, you can do that by going to the website, pointofview.net. We put it in your inbox every day. You receive mine Monday through Friday. Penedexters comes to your inbox on Saturday, so you get some of the facts and figures and other information that we think is valuable to you and are going to be useful tools for you to make the case before your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, and most importantly, in front of those individuals, those candidates that will be asking for your vote come November. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about prodigal sons and daughters. In particular, Karen Wheaton has an incredible story about her daughter, and I think it will be an encouragement to you to pray for your kids. We'll take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
If you've listened for any length of time, you've probably heard about Point of View listeners who've done amazing things, started ministries, found their life's calling, impacted their city, their state, the nation. But let me be clear, you don't have to have a huge impact to be faithful. I thought about that when I read a note from Joanne in Texas. She admitted, up until recently, I've not had much of a political view, nor have I ever been so informed. But since I signed up for your email and website information, I can now get the correct information that the public is oblivious to. Joanne ended by thanking us for the Take Action section of our website, where we make it easy for you to express your views on key issues with your elected representatives. Everything we do on the air, online, through mail and email is made possible through people like you who invest in Point of View, so we can invest in issues that matter. Take your place on the Truth Team. Call 1-800-347-5151 or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Let me begin by asking you a question. Do you have a prodigal in your family? Perhaps you do. Or do you know someone that does? I think by that time I probably have covered almost 100% of our listening audience. And if not, then I'll just say those few of you that could not raise your hand, someday you might, or run into someone who does, because that's really our topic this hour as we talk about this book, Watching the Road, Praying Your Prodigal Home. And if you think about watching the road, that, of course, goes back to the prodigal son in the Bible, where the father is watching the road for his son. In this case, we're going to talk about a prodigal daughter, but it doesn't make any difference whether it's a son or daughter. The principles are the same, and we are privileged to have in studio the author of this book, a singer and a recording artist, Karen Harris Wheaton, a gospel music singer. Many of us have seen you at Gaither Homecoming, and, of course, you are based out of Hamilton, Alabama. And again, we also know you as the founder of The Ramp, which is an outreach to young people. So, Karen, thank you for joining us today.
What an honor to be here so much. Thank you.
We really just kind of have to, for a few minutes, just tell your story before we get into some of the principles, because you grew up in a very small town, and at the same time sort of pursued what I think any girl would want to pursue, and that is, I found the man of my dreams, but things didn't turn out quite the way you expected them to. And then we, of course, bring in your daughters, and then a whole story that we're going to be talking about today.
Yes. You know, life does sometimes take unexpected turns for all of us, that's for sure. But, you know, I've been in the ministry now. This year will be my 40th year in full-time ministry. And I have two daughters, Lauren and Lindsay, and both of my daughters, obviously, were not just raised in a Christian home and in the presence of God all their lives. They were raised in the ministry, right, ministering with me, intensely involved in the forming of our ministry and all we were doing, which was just to the dream and delight of my heart. Mm-hmm. They married, both of them married ministers that were also involved in our ministry. So it just seemed like the ideal setup, and everything was fine until it was probably about, I don't know, a little over 5 years ago now when it first began, when my youngest daughter was just targeted by the enemy. Mm-hmm. It's the best way I know how to put it.
Yes.
Now, her husband's the pastor of the Ramp Church. He's the director of our School of Ministry. She is over our Performing Arts Department. So a very crucial part of our ministry. And I began to notice subtle changes in her life and just the person of who she was. And at first, I just really didn't know what was going on. I just kind of kept moving forward. But under the surface, there was a crisis brewing until in the spring of 2014, she came and informed all of us that she was filing for divorce with no biblical grounds. She was leaving her family. She moved to a different city and just became a different person. So, you know, as a mother, I mean, you know, you love your children. You know, I love God for most of everything. I love my children more than ministry. Mm-hmm. So for me, my world turned upside down. And I was faced with some very crucial decisions I had to make for my role in this. And those 2 years, Kerby, sent me on a journey of intercession and prayer that changed my life and allowed me to be a witness to the greatest miracle I have ever personally experienced.
And I might just mention before the program ends this hour, we're going to talk about the importance of prevailing prayer. We're going to talk about the weapons of our warfare and some of that. But give us a little bit of the backstory, because you wonder why a child, and we've all had these experiences, whether you've been in ministry as I have, just like you have, or whether you've just been in church, you hear these kids just all of a sudden go like this. But sometimes there's a backstory, and, maybe it's because you had gone through a divorce that you did not want. Or maybe it's because of the secular influence of the world. Have you ever tried to kind of figure out how this young, sweet, Christian-oriented girl all of a sudden one day finds herself saying, I'm going to give up on all this. I'm going to go find myself and divorce this man that I'm actually married to?
Yeah, I think all of us as parents ask those questions over and over. We have to ask ourselves, did I have anything to do with this?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it the culture that we're living in? And probably a little bit of all of it, possibly.
Yes. Yeah.
But the truth is, it boils down to one thing in Ephesians 6. The word says that we are wrestling against powers and principalities and rulers of darkness, wickedness in high places. I think there's an important word there. We are wrestling. This is a fight with light and darkness. And there is an enemy out to destroy our lives and the lives of our children. So when we realize that, we have to decide, something? My family is worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to just sit here and allow the enemy to come in and take from me what means more to me than anything in the world without a fight. And so that's what the book is about. It is about that journey of prayer, prevailing prayer that resulted in tremendous victory.
It seems to me that there is some evidence that if you're in ministry, your kids even have more of a target on them. I just came back from a ministry trip, and it was amazing how many times I would talk to different people in ministry. And it seems to me the exception where you have a family where none of the kids strayed. It seems to be almost the rule. And I remember years ago, one time I was even preaching on the fact that I said, these kids have a target on their back. And so then somebody did a skit the next day where he had a target on his back. But forget about the joke that they made of my point. Because you were in ministry, in some respects, your daughters, and one in particular, had more of a target on their back than maybe the other people you were ministering to, don't you think?
I think so. A lot of times with pastors' children or ministers' children, many times we see that experienced. I remember years ago when I first began to work with young people. It was in 1998. Mm-hmm. And I'd been in the ministry 20 years at that point. I never dreamed I would be working with young people. And when the Lord first called me to work with the youth of my community, I remember something that was very specific and clear. And he lays this on my heart. And I explained to God why I was not the person to work with young people. I said, I'm too old. I'm not cool. I am busy in ministry. But then he said this to me that caught my attention and my heart. He said, but what you invest in the lives of other young people, you'll reap in your children. Now, I had no idea how much I was going to need the fulfillment of that promise. But, for pastors that are listening right now, ministers that are listening, you can be assured that you will reap what you have sown.
Yes.
And as they have sown in the lives of so many other people, we should have the expectancy that we can reap back into our children's lives what we've sown in the lives of so many other people. So God did that for me, and he's going to do that for your listeners today.
It's always a puzzle because we see some of these kids that grow up in a Christian home. They have fathers who are pastors. They have mothers who are singers or gospel presenters, or they maybe worked in the church, or they traveled as a ministry of some sort or another, and they know truth, but then they stray from it. So when we come back and talk more about that, also want to talk about the ramp and how that came to be. Maybe even your experience in a tornado. You've got just all sorts of stories in this book that we'll get into, and I think as we go through this, a little bit later, we're going to open up the phones because maybe you have a prodigal in your life. I know Karen would be glad to pray for that prodigal and also share some of the things that she learned in the process. We have a lot more to cover. We have a break that we need to take. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, more than 100 million American adults claim to have a biblical worldview, but actually a much smaller percentage of adults do. This is one of the striking conclusions of George Barna's survey with the American Culture and Faith Institute. It is important to know how many people have a biblical worldview because belief drives behavior, and it is important for George Barna to get an accurate baseline to use in future comparisons. His survey asked 20 questions about core spiritual beliefs and 20 questions assessing behavior. You were considered to have a strong biblical belief if you got at least 80% of the questions correct. Based on that, they concluded that 10% of American adults have a biblical worldview. This pales in comparison to the 46% of adults who claim to have a biblical worldview. When you look at the 20 questions assessing biblical behavior, you see similar trends. You were considered to have strong biblical behavior if you got 80% of the behavior questions correct. Based on that, they concluded that 18% of American adults have strong biblical behavior. The survey also identified what it called an integrated disciple. They are Christians who have the intention of being an imitator of Christ. They blend their beliefs and behaviors into a Christ-like lifestyle, and about 10% have strong biblical beliefs and behavior. This means that they correctly answered more than 80% of each category in the survey. One of the trends that match other surveys was the realization that the younger an adult is, the less likely they are to have a biblical worldview. Just 4% were integrated disciples, while much older adults were in the 16% range. The survey of core beliefs and behavior is one more reminder of the need for good Bible teaching and biblical discipleship. Obviously, we have much more work to do. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Here in Wheaton in studio today as we talk about the book Watching the Road, Praying Your Prodigal Home. And you can find out more information on her website, which is theramp.org. By the way, it has a number of events. Some of you that are in Arkansas, listeners there, can actually go and hear Conway and a number of other places. And, of course, you can watch a variety of videos. But just for a minute, before we get back to, of course, the story of your daughter, The Ramp is a wonderful ministry. Talk about that, because a ramp takes you from one level to the next. And it was your daughter that really, I think, came up with that idea, right?
We were trying to decide what to call this place. And I said to my daughter one day in the early days of the ramp, I said, now, Lord, what are we going to call this? I said, it's kind of like a rally. It's kind of like a camp. And she said, it's a ramp. So that's where the name came from initially. But it's a wonderful place. It's been there for 20 years now. It started off as a youth conference center where young people came to from really all over the nation and even other nations. And they come to encounter the presence of God. And when they experience that, they have what we call the awakening of the reality of the real God. And so kids' lives are transformed as they would be in the presence of the real God. So the testimonies are astounding as to what's happened. And this is the miracle of it all. In the last 20 years, of several 100,000 kids have come to that small town of Hamilton, Alabama,
Yes.
to encounter the presence of God. So yeah, that's what the ramp is.
And you're living in the grandmother's house, right?
I still do.
That
I
is
still
just,
live in my grandmother's house, which is part of the story of the book.
It's a great story there as well. So again, if you'd like to know more about the ramp, or if you happen to be in Alabama and like to go to Hamilton, Alabama and see it, you can do so. Or, of course, you also bring the ministry to them. And I mentioned again that there's a place where you have events and media and a number of other things, so people can find out about that. There's a podcast. And most importantly, there's this book, Watching the Road. But here's a good illustration. You're ministering to all these other kids. And sometimes, Karen, you'll appreciate this because I've seen the same thing with mine. You can minister to other kids and you can impart spiritual truth and they just absorb it because you're not their parent. Then you try to share the same spiritual truth with your kids, and sometimes they accept it, sometimes they don't, because you're just dad, and we can, again, another danger point for some in ministry, you're spending so much time with other people's kids, you're not discipling and mentoring your own kids, right?
That's true. And that's one of the things that's so great about the ramp is because people send their kids. I've had parents pay their children, many parents actually, pay their kids to come.
Mm-hmm.
And on the last hour of the last night, finally there's a breakthrough.
Yes.
We've had tremendous testimonies come out of that. Because you're right, sometimes kids will listen to someone else where they're not necessarily listening to mom and dad at home. But hey, if mom and dad at home will pray and get them to a place where they can experience the presence of God, those walls can be broken.
I've done some conferences where I see heel marks at the back of the room because they were brought there under duress. But again, if you can get them, there's grace in the place sometimes, isn't there?
That's right.
And when you're praying for them, there's some things that happen in those circumstances. Why I love to do Christian camps and conferences and things like that, because you go and even to this day, Karen, and ask people, where'd you become a Christian? Child Evangelism Fellowship, Christian camp, whatever like it. How many of you had some major breakthrough in your marriage? And again, they'll mention, Weekend to Remember, or camp, or something like that. So it's just, again, those venues sometimes can be a place where God can really work on people's lives, can't they?
And there's nothing more important in the world. There's no greater investment we can make as parents than to get our children into a place where they can encounter the presence of God. There's nothing more important. It's worth any cost and any effort. So, if they could, have them come to one of the conferences. Come with them or send them with a youth group. We have the conferences almost every month. We have had conferences for 20 years. Of course, there's a church there now and a school of ministry, a 2-year school of ministry there, too.
Right.
But yeah, it's life-changing.
It is. I thought I'd mention, since I did mention the tornado, one of the more gripping chapters in the book is when all of a sudden you recognize you're going to be in the midst of a really major meteorological event. Tell us more about that.
It was the strangest thing. It was the year 2011, and there had actually been a prophetic word released from a man that I highly respect. To be honest with you, I didn't know him at the time he gave the word, but he was speaking in Birmingham, Alabama. In the middle of his message, he begins to give this word from the Lord that there was going to be an F5 tornado heading toward Hamilton, Alabama, and that he said people need to give the people a warning there that it's coming. Well, they did. They sent me this message of this man's word, and I considered it because I thought, well, maybe it's a spiritual storm. Well, I was right about that, and he was right about the other. 6 weeks later, on April the 27th, 2011, of course, it was that day when a series of tornadoes just blasted through the southeast, unfortunately killing many precious people. And in Hamilton, there was an F5 that formed over the city of Hamilton, went over my house, causing extensive damage and killing a lot of people in our area. So it was a devastating time, but it was a spiritual sign of something that was coming in my life. So yes, it was a natural storm, but a prophetic word of what we were really stepping into with my daughter. Because sometimes in our lives, we have these spiritual storms that a lot of the listeners are in today. And I believe that's why they're listening to this word today, because we serve the one who brings peace to those storms.
Yes. Well, again, that was the physical storm. Let's talk about the spiritual storm. Take us to, again, it's kind of in the middle of the book, where it's almost like a knife in your heart, where she just says, I'm done. I'm going to get a divorce. Talk about that.
Yeah, my daughter came in and, like I said, just turn to someone else. I don't know if your listeners have ever experienced this. Probably some have, where you love someone who just turns into someone you do not know.
Right.
And what happens? You just ask yourself 1,000 questions. In the journey, as time began to move on and things were going from bad to worse, some of my friends were actually concerned about me as her mother.
Sure.
And I remember them giving me the advice, now, Karen, you're going to have to move on. You're going to have to accept this. She's an adult. You can't control her life. You're going to have to accept this and move on. That was a real critical time for me. Because as a Christian, I was thinking, really? I mean, is this the way it is? Mm-hmm. That we serve this God who tells us there's nothing impossible with him, but we have to just sit here and allow the enemy to come in and wreak havoc in our homes, and we can't do anything about it? That we have to accept that? So it made no sense for me. So I determined what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this God I've served my whole life and say to him, what do you, God, have to say about what's happening in my daughter's life? And I'm going to stay right here till he speaks. And he did. And what my determination was, I will stand in this place in faith until my daughter's life looks like the word God gave me. And that was what the book is about.
Well, and there was also kind of a second time where then she goes, finds a boyfriend and all that kind of stuff. And then I think it was Casey was actually supposed to then put his kids in the car of that boyfriend, and that's when he finally said, I'm done. And then you had to take off and go and really cry and pray, because you always held out the hope that maybe she would come back to him, and if nothing else, he would fight for the marriage even if she wouldn't. And that was almost a second breaking point, wasn't it?
Well, it was 2 years of intercession every single day, intentionally focused in prayer, praying that his heart would remain tender and soft to be able to forgive her and take her back someday, and praying that her heart would see truth. Mm-hmm. So it was nonstop prayer. But at the end of the journey, it seemed so interesting to Kerby. On the journey, I would receive a word from God and it would get worse. So to your listeners, they need to know, just because things get worse doesn't mean it's over.
Right.
In fact, it usually means God is at work. But I would get a word thinking, this is it, victory today. The circumstances before the sun gets down.
Worse.
Oh, it's by far.
Yeah.
So it was a testing of faith. But at the end of the journey, when it seemed all was impossible, when it seemed it was completely over, and in the natural it looked like all my promises from God had failed, he came through. I read something the other day that I feel to share to a listener right now. It's powerful. It says this: God doesn't always come quickly, but he comes suddenly. So in those 2 years, I kept thinking, why, God, and where are you?
Yes.
Where are you? So it wasn't as quickly as I wanted, but when he came suddenly, and he delivered. And listen to me. He kept every single promise he made me.
We're going to take a break and come back and hear the rest of that story. And again, if you want to really increase your prayer life, Watching the Road is one of those. Of course, the books by Stormy O'Mardian would fit into that category as well. So lots of great resources. But again, we have a link to theramp.org. If you'd like to know more about Karen, Wheaton, and the Ramp and the book, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We come back, we have more to share because we have still left a few question marks there. We're going to resolve those and see how God resolved those. But also, if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you've had a prodigal son or daughter. Maybe you have a question, or maybe you'd like to hear a little bit more about the story from Karen. Give us a call. We'll be back right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants his best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5150. 5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Talking about prodigal sons and daughters, and if you would like to join us, let's open up our phones, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you have a story of a prodigal son or daughter that is left, maybe still gone. Maybe you have a story about how they've come back, and I'd love to know what you've done. Of course, you've certainly heard the importance of praying for that son or daughter, and we'll continue our conversation with Karen Wheaton about the book Watching the Road. But let me just for a minute, as we always like to do at about this time, talk about what's on your website, because when people go to theramp.org, it's at our website, pointofview.net, you've got all sorts of videos. There's a way people can connect up with you through Facebook and Twitter and also YouTube. You have some events, and you might have some young people that would like to come to the Ramp. So talk about what's available when they land on your website.
Well, the Ramp is, of course, a conference center where young people come from all over the nation and experience the presence of God. So they can go online and get the information on our upcoming conferences. And I can't stress enough, even to parents, to get their children there. High school, college age, it's really for any age. It's for people hungry for the presence of God, but to bring them there, whatever it takes. Just to encounter. That is the answer. There is no plan B. There's no other answer greater than an encounter in the presence of God for our kids.
Let's talk about that, too, because you bring a lot to the table in terms of musical talent, in terms of biblical conviction, teaching, preaching, praying, and all the rest. So in some respects, there's a lesson to be learned here. It isn't just one tool. Be careful if a person only has a hammer or a screwdriver in their toolbox, because they'll, if they have a hammer, treat everything like a nail. If they have a screwdriver, treat everything like a screw. We have lots of different kinds of ways in which we can break through to a hardened heart, don't we?
We do, and there is nothing greater than the power of prayer to do that. And I experienced that, of course, believing God for the return of my daughter. There was no other option, really, I felt I even had, except that I had to hear from God and to use the tools that he had given me, the power of his name, the power of his word, and the power of his blood. Aren't you thankful, though, that we are not in this fight alone?
That's right.
But there is a promised victory for those of us that know God and walk with God. So I'm encouraging the listeners today that have prodigal sons and daughters. The number one thing I would tell them is don't stop praying.
Very good.
Don't ever give up, even when it looks worse instead of better. And the more you pray, the worse it gets. Don't stop praying. Even sometimes when you're trying to hope and you get hope in your heart and you get excited, you think things might be changing, and then your hope is devastated. Sometimes hope hurts, and we want to build a wall to protect ourselves. And to try to think about just living our lives. You're going to live your life. I'm going to live my life. And we're going on. So I won't hurt anymore. But when we throw away our hope, we've thrown away our faith. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. So I want to encourage your listeners today, keep hoping. Let hope live again, that God can do anything. I don't care how far away from God they are. It does not matter. Their heart is still beating, and so is yours. There's hope.
You know, this book is one that you never thought you were going to write, right?
Never dreamed.
And yet, nevertheless, 150 pages, which, again, I think would be a book that I would want to put in the hands of any parent who is really struggling with a prodigal child. So I want to spend some time getting into some of the other aspects, but along the way, I'd like to hear from some of our listeners, wouldn't you? So let's, if we can, head to Chris in California. And Chris, I think you have a testimony about your prodigal son. Please share.
Yes, I've been divorced most of my son's life. He's 15 years old. I did raise him in the church. I made sure that was the most important thing, was to take him to the Lord, and so he would know the Lord, and he was going to Sunday school and gave himself to the Lord twice. And then now at age 15, he is starting, he started questioning evolution and science, and then started questioning, sexual morality and those type of things. And now he won't talk to me about the Lord. He won't call me or talk to me. Sometimes he'll text me. But I was listening to the station, and I heard that about the prodigal son. And I have faith. I have the faith that, the Lord says he will come back. you know, and that basically is my testimony, and I'm just having faith and thank God for your show.
Well, let me encourage, first of all, our listeners to pray for Chris. And there is a good example of the kind of influence that comes from the world. One of the reasons why we spend so much time on this program talking about how to not only articulate a biblical worldview, which is the topic of my Viewpoints commentary today, but also to know how to defend it. Because our young people today are assaulted by sexual values, which are contrary to Scripture. He mentioned evolution, views about origin that are contrary to Scripture, and even an anti-authoritarian view that says, well, your parents don't know anything anyway. And even sometimes before, in this case, they even go off to college, they've already begun to stray from the faith. So we really want to equip parents and even equip the young people listening right now, since it's during the summer. They can be listening in as well or watching this again on the YouTube channel, that there are answers to the questions they have. But there is a real pull right now, don't you think, Karen, from the world? And this is why we have to recognize the weapons of our warfare are not fleshly, but spiritual. And we need to tear down strongholds and lofty thoughts raised up against the knowledge of God. What are your thoughts?
And we're not in that fight alone. And the thing is when we have just a focused, intentional love for our children, and they know that we love them, we are making an effort to communicate with them and communicate that love. I would encourage Chris to do that with his son, that that young man knows my dad is there for me. But we don't ever compromise truth as parents. There's always love and truth that works together. They know we love them, but they know what we stand for, no matter what. No matter what, I'm going to love you, but I cannot stand with you if what you're doing is going to destroy your life.
Yes.
So they need to know both, that we have a standard and we're not moving from that standard, but our love for them will never change. And also doing whatever it takes to keep them in the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
The place we worship, where we go to church, making sure their friends are friends of good influence. No matter the cost and whatever the effort, keep them in a place where they can encounter the presence of God.
And again, that's one of the scriptural principles of speaking the truth in love. So we have our biblical convictions, but we also have our biblical compassion. And sometimes we just say, I'm going to stop speaking truth to them. They're not going to listen to me anyway. We found in the surveys, matter of fact, that I mentioned on our Viewpoints commentary today, that the number one influence to your kids is still you as a parent. They may not look like it, they may not act like it, but we have all sorts of surveys to show that the parents and sometimes the grandparents have a greater influence than, I hate to tell you, youth leaders, even more so than their youth pastors, their youth leaders, because the parents still are influential. And certainly you need to pray with perseverance, which is what you did for your daughter. And you talked about God coming suddenly. Let's finish this off, because I think everybody sort of figured out that you have a victory at the end of your book. But talk about that.
Yes, and I want to say, right before I say that, I made an intentional effort that Lindsay knew I had not cut her off.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to reach out to her, to take her to lunch when she would go with me. She didn't always go. She didn't always respond to my text. But I kept just being there the best that I could.
Yes.
To let her know I'm still here to go shopping or have fun with you. But yes, a glorious day came after 2 years of everyday prayer and intentional focus, intercession. On January the 10th, 2016, I received a phone call that Lindsay said, Mom, I'm coming over. And, we sat in the kitchen together, and she just looked at me and said, I don't know what happened, but this morning I woke up and I want to come home. And it reminded me of the day the prodigal son's father experienced the same thing, so to speak.
Right. Mm-hmm.
His son sat in the pig pen, and the Bible says he came to his senses.
Came to his mind, yeah.
And if these parents that are listening today will keep praying, never, never, never quitting, ever, they're going to experience that day when they will come to their senses and they have an awakening, because God answers prayer.
Again, the illustration that Jesus is using is what the Heavenly Father is like, watching the road. But it's also true for the earthly father, earthly mother, because that's why you say watching the road. I mean, there's a sense in which you want to intervene in their life. You want to, and sometimes you just have to let them come to their senses. You just have to pray God's judgment, God's action, God's mercy, whatever it might be. Sometimes they have to actually hit bottom before they look up. Or maybe one day, as in the case of your daughter, just wakes up and the scales fall off. But whatever it is, prevailing prayer is what was the reason for the success, right?
And it's a hard prayer to pray, but I actually got to the place where I was saying, Lord, if it takes it, accelerate the pig pen.
Yes.
Get her to the pig pen, if that's what will open her eyes. And when I didn't know what to pray anymore, my prayer at the end was, Lord, you know what to do. Do it.
Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Karen Wheaton with us, watching the road, praying your prodigal home. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee has signed into law a measure protecting the religious liberty of Tennessee's student athletes. The new law allows parents to opt their students out of participation in an athletic contest if the event is on an official school holiday, observed day of worship, or religious holiday. Moreover, it sets the authority aright by explaining that school officials may not require a student to attend an athletic event over the parent's objection. Some wonder how necessary such a measure is. They argue that schools already respect the religious choices of student athletes and do not punish those students who, for religious reasons, sit out of scheduled contests. That, I suppose, is a debate for the ages. Whether athletes should participate on holy days is not a new issue. Just watch the classic movie Chariots of Fire as but one example. Nonetheless, it is good to see the state of Tennessee explicitly stating that its school districts should be mindful that there are things to be respected of higher importance than sports. Athletics can teach students much about life, diligence, and teamwork, but life balance is a critical element taught by sports in school as well. Today's student athletes are tomorrow's business leaders who may be required to accommodate the religious practices of employees. Let us hope they learn the delicate balance of freedom well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We might be able to fit in another phone call in just a minute, but before we do so, in your last word, you have some great material here that I wanted to make sure we covered. The weapon of fasting, the weapon of prayer, as well as the weapon of the word, the weapon of believing, the weapon of obedience, and the weapon of watching, just some very important weapons. And we've been alluding to the fact that the weapons of our warfare are not fleshly but spiritual. And it seems to me that your testimony in this book and the testimony of you and your daughter illustrates again how we need to depend on those spiritual weapons that you talk about in the last chapter.
One of the things that I learned in that journey with my daughter when she was in deception was whenever I tried to talk with her and communicate with her, and she wouldn't hear anything I was saying. I found that when I could not reason with Lindsay, It would usually wear me out. I would leave more confused and hurt than when I started.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned an important thing for me. When you cannot reason with someone, you're probably dealing with the influence of a demonic spirit.
Right.
And so whenever you're speaking to someone like that, it's better just to close the conversation and go to your prayer closet. Just love them the best you can, but they can't do anything about what you're doing in prayer. So it was in that prayer closet I learned those weapons. So to experience the deliverance of my daughter, it took the weapon of fasting, which, I don't think any of us enjoy fasting, but I can tell you it works.
Mm-hmm.
The weapon of prayer, unceasing prayer. In Luke 18 and in Luke 11, Jesus teaches us how to pray. And the point of those illustrations is this: you pray and never give up. You don't stop for anything. You just never quit. It's shameless persistence of prayer. Go read those chapters, Luke 11 and Luke 18. The next thing was to believe the word, receive a word from God. God will speak to you if you ask him for his word. And when he speaks loud, clear, and often. Pray until you hear a word from God. When you hear a word from God about your child or your marriage or your finances or your situation of any kind, his word is the final answer. You cling to that word. Make a big deal out of that word. Write it down on an index card. Keep it in your Bible. Tape it to the refrigerator, to the steering wheel of your car. Keep that word in front of you and cling to that word and confess it out of your mouth until you see that thing become that word.
Well said. Let's take at least one more phone call. We'll go to North Carolina this time. Donna, it sounds like you have a story similar to Karen's.
I do, and thank you so much, Karen, for your testimony. I can't tell you how much my heart is overjoyed to hear your testimony. And I actually stumbled across this radio station today, and so I believe it was meant for me to call in and give my testimony, too, traveling back home from a conference. But I just wanted to share, my son was apprehended about 18 months ago for distribution of marijuana. And it was a huge distribution. He was facing 30 years from talking with the lawyers. And even after the lawyers, talking with the lawyers and him taking a plea, he was still facing 12 years. And I was just distraught when I first got the word, because no mother wants to see their child spend the rest of their life in prison, 30 years of their life in prison. And so I just literally wanted to die, and I wanted to commit suicide, actually, and because I just didn't want to deal with it. And then I just began to pray. And like you said, I did not stop praying. 18 months later, I went before his judge and spoke to the judge about the love I have for my son and just his character and the life he grew up in. But it was the grace of God. God has spoke to my heart well before the 18 months and said he will not do 30 years. He won't even do 10 years. And I have you to know my son will be home in another 2.5 years. And you can't tell me that was nobody but God. I kept asking God if you would just be the judge, be the mouthpiece for the judge, and whatever you would. And I didn't know which direction God was going to go in, but I knew that God had to work in my life and in my son's life. And so whatever his will, I asked it to be done in our lives. And God showed up and showed out. So I can just relate to the message that you're sending out to the world today. There's nothing more powerful than prayer. And I thank you again for your testimony, and I thank God for this radio station. And I ask you all to just keep doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Donna. And again, you are hearing us on a radio station in North Carolina. We're all over the country. So again, I hope you'll go to pointofview.net. And let's give some people some action items. First of all, of course, getting a copy of the book. But also, one of the things we always like to do, Karen, is encourage people to watch the trailer. And if they go to theramp.org, down on the bottom there, it's a 2-minute trailer, which is very well done, by the way, by Ramp Media. And so there is an opportunity for you to watch that. And then you will see that there is a way in which you can hit that button that allows you to put it on your Facebook page or your Twitter feed. Or maybe you know somebody right now that's struggling with a prodigal son or prodigal daughter. You can, by email, send it to them. So one of the assignments I give to all of you today is go to theramp.org, watch the video, watch the trailer, send it out, and then some other people will know about the book. But again, talk about what else is available when people go to theramp.org, because there's just some great resources. And most importantly, if you have a son or daughter, if you can get them to Alabama, there's going to be some things in which God's going to show up and change their life.
Well, my daughter also wrote a book on her journey home. It's called The Way Home.
Mm-hmm.
They can find that information at theramp.org or call the office. Just contact us, and we can tell you how to find her book, which is an incredible revelation of how the enemy deceives the mind little by little. So it's an incredible resource, and there's many resources. Our music is there and things that I believe will bless their lives.
Well, and again, I was hoping we could have you and your daughter on. Maybe we can do that again sometime. You think that'd be a possibility? Because she's got this incredible story. I feel funny about talking about her, but at the same time, she can help us understand what's in the mindset of young people. Tomorrow, for example, we have a millennial roundtable. Those are people born between 1980 and 2000. And we found that the millennial generation is the most secular generation. They really have, in many cases, not had Christian experiences, or in some cases turned their back on those Christian experiences. So it'd be fun to have her join the Millennial Roundtable, too, and give us some perspective on that as well. One last time, though, it's theramp.org. The book is entitled Watching the Road, Praying Your Prodigal Home. And Karen, I appreciate the incredible vulnerability in your book of sharing all these stories. And if people say, well, I've got the story down, no, you don't. It's 150 pages, and there's all sorts of great material, scripture verses and others about especially using these weapons of fasting and prayer and believing and obedience and all the rest that are part of a very good application. So whether you're dealing with a prodigal son or daughter, or you're dealing with some question about why did God put me in this situation, or why is my marriage not working, I think the principles in your book apply there as well, don't they?
They apply to any situation that seems impossible. And I want to say to your listeners before I go today, as people were telling me over and over, you have to accept this and just move on. I learned in that journey, you do not have to just accept anything that is not the will of God for your life. So that's why it's important to know the will of God. But once you know his word and his will, you don't have to move from that word. He will stand by his word if you will never, ever give up.
Just an incredible book. And as I've said more than once, if this doesn't light your fire, your wood is wet, because it's just a great story and an incredible reminder of the importance of prevailing prayer. So, Karen, thank you for coming in studio today and sharing your story.
Kirby, thank you for letting me be a part of Point of View.
We need to take a break. We have a lot more to cover. But again, if you find yourself wanting to know more about the book, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net, or you can go directly to theramp.org. We need to take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Let me ask you a question. How much time do you spend at work? Well, again, I love what David Platt uses in the foreword to the book we're going to be talking about. If you really look at people that work 40 hours a week for 40 years of their lives, that adds up to 80,000 hours at a job during their lifetimes. And, of course, those hours don't even include the thousands of hours spent in school preparing for work, on top of thousands of hours they spend in cars and planes and trains traveling to work. We're talking about something that really deserves us to think about from a Christian perspective. And so one of the things that we are going to try to do this hour is really focus on your work. And you've seen books on Your Work Matters to God. We've talked a great deal about how to apply a biblical view of work. And so we come to this book that came out a number of years ago, now is updated and expanded, The Gospel at Work, How the Gospel Gives New Purpose and Meaning to Our Jobs. Sebastian Traeger and Greg Gilbert are the authors, and Sebastian joins us. He's the Executive Vice President of the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention, but before that has worked in the business world and built a number of companies such as 5 Street and Razoo and Silos Partners and Village Phone, to mention just a few. And Sebastian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is great to have you here, and the book is something we're going to try to cover over the next hour. Almost 200 pages of great insights. But to really understand this, you talk about how in some respects we can go to one extreme or the other. Either we can deal with idleness in work or idolatry in work. Let's talk about that, because you share, even in your own experience, that you felt that you at one time were guilty of maybe making your work an idol in some way or another. Explain that, if you might.
Yeah, so what we do in the book is we try to help people diagnose where they are in relation to a biblical view of work. And so one of the ways, and again, as you mentioned, I definitely would say I've been guilty of this. One of the ways we see people going wrong in the way they approach their work is that they make their work an idol. And so if you think about what an idol was in the Bible, obviously in the Bible we think of it as kind of gold statues that you might bow down to, or a golden calf in the wilderness. But it's effectively what an idol is anything that you organize and order your life around. And so certainly I think our culture puts a lot of pressure on us to order and organize our lives around our jobs and the work that we do. And as I kind of said biographically in the book, I know that for myself, this is something I've been guilty of. I've been guilty of thinking that work is one of the most important things in my entire life. And so that has elevated, it's almost as though I've elevated my work above my relationship with Jesus.
Well, again, we recognize that in some respects our work is a primary source of significance for individuals. I know that you can go to some men retreats and other kinds of retreats where they'll say, we want you to introduce yourself to someone else, but not tell them what you do. And that can be a real stumper for some individuals, because everything they are is tied up in their profession. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a businessman, I work in this area, I'm a pastor, I'm a missionary, whatever it might be. And you can see how that right off the bat can cause people a little bit of distress if they can't really talk about themselves but are prevented from talking about their work because, after all, like we just mentioned a minute ago, 80,000 hours by the time you retire. It's obviously something that ties up very much with who you are and what you do every day.
Absolutely. Well, and even that thought, I mean, so I would say what we want to do is help people see that work is important. It's created by God. So if you think about theology of work, if you will, a lot of people sometimes think work is a product of the fall, of Adam and Eve's sin and rebellion against God. Well, that's actually not true. We see God was a worker, right? Obviously, in Genesis 1, God created the world. He created all things. He said it was good. And then he created Adam and Eve and said they are very good. And then he rested. And so we see work. He then gave Adam and Eve work to do in the garden, name the animals and take dominion effectively. And so we see work as a good gift of God. But what happened is that when Adam and Eve rebelled against God, no longer were we capable of perfectly worshiping God in the way that we work. Instead, we start worshiping things other than God. And so work becomes one of those things that we can worship. It was created to be something God created as good, something for us to worship while we did. But we, of course, start to effectively make it our identity, and it becomes something that we can worship. And that's just a danger we have to recognize and be aware of, the tendency to make an idol of that work.
Talking about the book, The Gospel at Work, it is published by Zondervan. You can certainly look for it in your local bookstore. We also have a connection and a link to the International Mission Board, so you can find out more as well. And just a minute ago, he was talking about kind of a biblical theology of work, and there's a number of appendices in the book. It's the second one there, a biblical theology of work from garden to glory. And so, again, in addition to the fact that there are some excellent chapters in the book, I might just mention for a minute, Sebastian, that as you finish a particular chapter, you also have a section for further reflection. So this is where you can read a particular passage. There's a series of questions. So while this book is certainly one that I would want to put in the hands of anybody that wants to think about how to apply a biblical worldview to their work, I would think the way you structured this now would be a great way for small groups to actually get into this issue as well, don't you think?
Well, that's our hope. When we wrote the book, you know, we think there's a number of other books out there, really primarily talking about, say, vocation or theology of work or the history of work, and we touch on that. But what we really want to do is be more pastoral in the way we treat the topic. We want to help people see, not just have another thing that feels pretty detached from their everyday, but actually have people wrestle around the very issues that impact them and affect them every single day in the workplace. For example, we want people to really wrestle with, okay, if the gospel saves me and the good news also means that one day I will spend eternity with Christ in heaven, how does that impact choosing a job, for example? How should I think about that differently as a Christian? Or how does that impact my relationship with difficult bosses or coworkers? How does that impact, for example, the way I'm motivated every day to do my job? So this is how we've kind of organized the book. And so we really hope it is a resource for small groups who want to say, yeah, we want to try to connect the Bible with that kind of 9 to 5. And that's really the heart of the book. And, you know, honestly, it came out of my own personal just desire for more answers. I think churches, do an amazing job at equipping us to understand the Bible, to pursue the Lord. But I think sometimes they might not do as great a job equipping us in thinking about the particulars of, say, a secular job and how I can glorify God with that and how I can do that in the most effective way.
Sebastian Traeger with us as we are talking about the book that he co-authored with Greg Gilbert, The Gospel at Work, How the Gospel Gives New Purpose and Meaning to Our Jobs, published by Zondervan. We talked a little bit about idolatry in work. We'll come back and talk about idleness in work. And then what about this idea of the gospel in the workplace? How does that fit? A lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, more than 100 million American adults claim to have a biblical worldview, but actually a much smaller percentage of adults do. This is one of the striking conclusions of George Barna's survey with the American Culture and Faith Institute. It is important to know how many people have a biblical worldview because belief drives behavior, and it is important for George Barna to get an accurate baseline to use in future comparisons. His survey asked 20 questions about core spiritual beliefs and 20 questions assessing behavior. You were considered to have a strong biblical belief if you got at least 80% of the questions correct. Based on that, they concluded that 10% of American adults have a biblical worldview. This pales in comparison to the 46% of adults who claim to have a biblical worldview. When you look at the 20 questions assessing biblical behavior, you see similar trends. You were considered to have strong biblical behavior if you got 80% of the behavior questions correct. Based on that, they concluded that 18% of American adults have strong biblical behavior. The survey also identified what it called an integrated disciple. They are Christians who have the intention of being an imitator of Christ. They blend their beliefs and behaviors into a Christ-like lifestyle, and about 10% have strong biblical beliefs and behavior. This means that they correctly answered more than 80% of each category in the survey. One of the trends that match other surveys was the realization that the younger an adult is, the less likely they are to have a biblical worldview. Just 4% were integrated disciples, while much older adults were in the 16% range. The survey of core beliefs and behavior is one more reminder of the need for good Bible teaching and biblical discipleship. Obviously, we have much more work to do. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about the gospel at work, how the gospel gives new purpose and meaning to our jobs. We spend so many hours every day, and how do we think about this biblically? And Sebastian Traeger with us. And Sebastian, we talked a little bit about idolatry of work. Before we get into some of the practical aspects, let's also talk about the other extreme, idleness in work. Now, most people might misunderstand. They might say, I'm certainly not idle. I'm working all the time. But that's not exactly the point you were making here, because in some respects, idleness has more to do with kind of a mindset, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's where, biblically, again, defined, you could say idleness means not working, doing nothing. And I think that's what Paul warns about when he says, he who doesn't work shall not eat. I think he's literally saying if you do nothing, you cannot eat. But when we think about idleness, obviously there's some who are not working, but I think more common to the Christian is the type of idleness of heart that detaches what it means to be a Christian, and the fact that the gospel has changed their lives with their work, with their day-to-day work. And so at some level, they have making an idol of work kind of elevates Jesus above their work. I think being idle at work almost lowers Jesus below your work, almost makes it less important than it needs to be.
And again, one of the things that it helps set up is this idea of the truth of the gospel relates to both idolatry. I think everybody can see that, but also the truth of the gospel, you say, cuts to the root of idleness, because as you quote from the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper, who said, there's not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mind. The point is that every aspect of our life needs to come under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so there is a tendency today, Sebastian, I'm sure you would agree with this, of people having kind of this sacred secular dichotomy, that the sacred is what I do at church, maybe even how I raise my kids, but then I leave that behind as I go into the boardroom, the classroom, the newsroom, whatever it might be, because I do not see how Christianity relates to my work. And your book is really an attempt to help people make that connection, isn't it?
It is. And so, I mean, let me give an example of this. So when I was 18 years old, I started one of my first companies, actually maybe a little earlier, 16, and it was basically sealing decks. And, when I sealed a deck, I was kind of very proud of how fast and how quickly and how, easily I could do that and how much money I could make in as little time. That was really what my driving goal was. It wasn't, how can I image and represent God best? How can I show the world that God is an excellent worker, that the energy and the ethic that he goes about his work is different, right? Is what's created the world. Well, in one of these decks that I sealed, I still remember this guy kind of called me over and he said, "Hey, come over and check out this deck that you sealed." And I looked at it and I thought, "Oh, this is great. It looks beautiful." And he's like, "Yeah, that's right. Look at the spindles, the poles. Look how nice those are. That's right. They look great." He's like, "That's right. Let me just come over and look at one more thing." And there I come over and he rolls away a potted plant, and underneath it was an unsealed deck. Right? I hadn't even taken the time in my haste for making money or my haste for going fast. I wasn't thinking about serving him. I wasn't thinking about imaging and representing the Lord. I was just thinking about how quickly can I do this and how much can I make doing it. And I think that example, again, you're not going to be as immature as I was as a 16-year-old maybe, but I think a lot of us detach what it means to be a Christian from the excellence, the ethics, the way we go about our work. And so this book is really a call for people to examine their hearts and ask, listen, if you are not working in a way that is honoring the King, we think that should be the highest motivation you possibly have, doing work for the King. And so we want to encourage Christians to do their work with the excellence, the ethic, and all their ability as befitting the King of Kings.
Well, again, the idea there is that you work unto the Lord. You work for Jesus, as you say. And you even talk about the fact that working for Jesus gives you freedom to worship God through your work. Working for Jesus gives you the freedom to serve others. Working for Jesus gives you the freedom to trust God in your work. And working for Jesus gives you freedom to rest from your work, as well as gives you freedom to do your work well and to have joy in your work. So there is a sense in which once you get the attitude right, all sorts of other things fall into place, don't they?
They sure do. So even going back to your example you gave about men's conferences where people had to kind of introduce themselves
Yes.
without saying what they did, I think about that. One of the more profound things I learned in writing this book, and it's in there, is a simple phrase that I think really summarizes a ton in my mind of some of the challenges we find. And that phrase is, who you work for is more important than what you do. So who you work for is more important than what you do. And so much of our culture and our own hearts are tied up in the what we do. It's almost like we think to ourselves, who cares if I'm really a Christian? Who cares if the King of the universe has redeemed me? What's really important is the kind of job that I get or the kind of work that I do or how quickly I can do my work or any of those types of things. And we really think that's got to be flipped around. What's really unique is the fact that the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, has redeemed you, has given you a new life and a new heart. And if that is set and secure and that's your identity, then all of a sudden almost any work that you do is an incredible opportunity to make much of that King.
Let's, if we can, maybe answer that question that is in the minds of especially some of the young people listening over the summer, maybe some thinking about graduating and what they might do, because you have a chapter there on how should I choose a job, because first of all, the motivation is important. It all, as you said, doesn't even matter what kind of job you have if you have the right motivation. But once you have the right motivation, there are some choices that people can make. To take a bizarre example, yes, you can work under the Lord as a thief or as a pimp or a variety of other things, but that's not honoring to the Lord. So it is more than just the right attitude. It's also the selecting those particular ways in which you can use the gifts and abilities and various aspects of God making you to actually use that in a way through your job that glorifies Him. So how do we go through that particular choice? Because it's important to find the right job and the right way in which you can use the gifts that God has given to you.
Absolutely. Well, Kerby, again, we want to make sure this book is, and it's just positive. We want people to live fulfilled lives under the Lord and find purpose and meaning in their jobs. Interestingly, though, we would say the way you do that is, again, first recognizing that it's the Lord who all of your work is for. So really what you're doing is not as much choosing a job as you are discovering, okay, what assignment does the Lord have for me? What is it that He would have me to do? And as you go through that process, we recommend, or we, in our book, we talk about really breaking that into kind of two different buckets as you think about it. One is must-haves. What are the must-haves biblically for choosing a job? What are the things that the Bible says really have to be true of it? And then, secondarily, what are the nice-to-haves? So must-haves, those are the things that, like, I really have to get right. And the nice-to-haves are exactly that. If I can get them, that's great. So we would say the must-haves, just three simple questions. Does a particular job glorify God? And praise God, honestly, if your job is not causing you to, it's not specific sin, and it's not causing you to sin, there's so many things that can glorify God. As you serve your neighbor, as you love your neighbor through your work, as you serve and support bosses and others, so many things can glorify God. Second question is, does it permit me to live a godly life? So in taking on this job, am I tempted to shirk other responsibilities I have? Or is it allowing me to invest in other ways, in my family, in my church, in my community? Or is it kind of forcing me to again, be idle in some of those responsibilities? And then does it provide for my needs, right? Does it allow me to make money and support myself and be a blessing to my family and others? Those are kind of the biblical must-haves. And so we counsel everyone, make sure those three things are true. A job glorifies God, permits you to live a godly life, and then provides for your needs. After that, you have tremendous freedom in the nice-to-haves, tremendous freedom, because Scripture actually doesn't tell you have to do anything else. And so every other person, if you're kind of caught in a situation where you're trying to choose between things, our thought is make sure the must-haves are there, and then if you can get the nice-to-haves, have them. And those are things like, does it benefit society? Does it allow you to kind of be a blessing to others? Can you do it well? Obviously, take into account what you're good at. And then do you want to do it? Do you have a desire for it? So these are, again, we'd say absolutely go for them, but just don't get crippled in indecision or kind of keep waiting forever if you never find those nice-to-haves.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's take some phone calls, too. Perhaps you have a comment or a question. You wonder, can I really share the gospel in my work? How do I handle a difficult boss or coworker? Is full-time ministry maybe more valuable than my secular job? These are questions that are addressed in the book, but perhaps you have some similar kinds of questions. We are privileged to talk with Sebastian today, and the book is entitled The Gospel at Work. We'll be right back.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Sebastian Traeger. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Again, your work matters to God. We'd love to know your thoughts about how to apply biblical principles to your work, and we're going to get into some of these practical questions, which are all found in the book, The Gospel at Work. Came out a number of years ago, but now this one is updated and expanded. You can find a copy in your local bookstore, or, of course, it is published by Zondervan. We have a link there as well. Let's, if we can, get into some of those. One of those is the issue of balance. Just so happens this Sunday I'm going to be speaking in my Sunday school class about the issue of balance, because so often there's a kind of a, what about a work-life balance, a balance between work, church, and family? One of your chapters addresses that issue, and talk through some of the principles that we need to understand there to begin to have a balance that honors God.
Yeah, this question, I think, is one that is just immediately applicable to everybody, right? Most people either feel like their head's underwater. I think that's probably the majority of people. Obviously, some probably feel like I've got extra margin, extra bandwidth. What can I do with it? And I would say the key principle to think about here is that nowhere in the Bible are we actually called to a life of balance. Actually, Christians are called to live a sold-out life to Christ. And we see that, right, where Jesus basically says, seek him first and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you, right? Seek first the kingdom of God. That's what we are to be sold out for. We are to be sold out for Christ and for the kingdom. And so then the question really becomes a question of, how do I organize all those other assignments God has given me, from work to family, whether I'm single or married with children, to church? How do I now think through all these different assignments and make sure they're all focused on that one overarching goal, which is to live a life sold out to the Lord Jesus? And so the way we would say to do that is to kind of look at those secondary assignments, and rather than looking at how your friends are living, even your Christian friends, recognize that all of us are wired very differently. We have different levels of energy. We have different capacities, abilities, family histories, responsibilities. We all have so many different things going on in our lives. And so it really requires us, not all by ourselves, but in community with others, to look at what does the Bible define as the responsibilities as a church member, the responsibilities in family, the responsibilities in the workplace. And then how do I compare to those what the Bible defines as what faithfulness looks like? How am I doing on kind of that faithfulness scorecard? That's what we think is the best way to look at this question. Think to yourself, I need to be sold out for Christ, and I need to be faithful in these different assignments. First, evaluate, what does faithfulness look like biblically? How am I doing? And to the extent I see ways where I'm not living faithfully, I need to repent of those, and I need to start living faithfully in those areas. And to the extent that I am living faithfully in all these areas, start praying, okay, God, where can I invest more energies, more resources in which of these responsibilities or assignments that you've given me? So when we think about balance, that's the key thing we want to get across to people.
And again, it's the idea of faithfulness and fruitfulness. And again, some great material in the book, The Gospel at Work. Let's take some phone calls, and this one I think will lead us into one of the other chapters in the book. And we'll go to Pamela in Texas. You're on with Sebastian Traeger.
Good afternoon, Sebastian.
Hi, Pamela.
I'm enjoying your topic on today. And I usually listen to this station when I get a chance. I enjoy you, Kerby.
Thank you. So what's your comment for us today?
Yes, my comment is that as a Christian, I'll give you an example of myself. When I started to working for this company, I said, Lord, let me reach everybody in this company from headquarters to the janitor. I thought it meant that I was going to, be promoted. But it so happened that the Lord worked that out by them always lying on me, so that management, top management, came down to investigate me. And so my method of preaching the gospel when I wasn't on break or, just working was singing praises to God. And we worked I worked the graveyard shift. And in the wee hours of the morning, I just started out singing, and I said I was waking the people up so they could work. And they allowed me to do that for 27 years.
Let's talk about that, because that really gets us into the chapter there, I would have to say, Sebastian, about how can I share the gospel at work? Now, she found an opportunity at a graveyard shift. Singing in the daytime might be a little tougher, but what about that? Because it does seem to me that we have to be careful, because obviously we are to honor the employer. And we've talked with Kelly Shackelford and others at First Liberty about the rights that Christians have in the workplace. But again, there's some biblical principles that we can use as we talk about in Chapter 9, how we share the gospel. So share those, if you might, with us.
Absolutely. And Pamela, I just praise God for your desire and your prayers that God would use you in the workplace. I think that's where, to some extent, we've got to start when we think about evangelism in the workplace. Christians should evangelize in the workplace for one simple reason, and that is, as a Christian, you're also an ambassador. And so you're always an ambassador, right? Whatever you're doing, wherever you are, whatever sphere of life, and you're always a representative of the Lord Jesus Christ. And part of that is proclaiming the gospel. Now, one area where I do think, and I just think we have to recognize that being an evangelist in the workplace does not always mean it's appropriate to be an evangelist during the, quote, 9 to 5, right? Employers are paying you for your time to do work for them. Some workplaces have cultures or downtime where it's absolutely fine to have conversations about other things. Other companies, I don't think, do. And honestly, I don't think that should bother you in the least at all. Your conscience should be clear. If you're in a workplace where it's just not appropriate to ever speak about the gospel, I don't think that should bother you. Unless, here's the big unless, what I would recommend is think about how can you be building gospel relationships in the workplace. So how can you be building good relationships in the workplace through the way you work, through the way you're a good friend to people, through the way you serve other people, through the way you just make it known that you're a Christian. All these different ways allow you to build relationships, and then invite people to breakfast ahead of work, to lunch during the day, to dinner afterwards. If you're working a graveyard shift, offer to give somebody a ride home. There's so many different ways to spend time with people who you meet at work that don't happen on kind of company time or company ground. And so I would say, listen, if you're being proactive in thinking about creative ways you can invite people to engage in conversations and just get to know them as a friend outside of work, I would say I would not be worried if you're in a workplace where communicating the gospel message is just not as appropriate.
And one of the things you talk about is do good work as a Christian. Sometimes when I speak to young people going off to college, I say, you've got an opportunity sometimes to share your faith in a classroom where it's appropriate, or even as you write a paper to your professor. But you're going to have a lot more credibility if you're doing good work in the classroom. If you are never perceived as ever asking a question, never really contributing to the conversation, if you never get a good grade on any of your papers, you're not going to have the same kind of opportunity to share your faith. The same thing is when people look around and they say, Bob over there, he's a really good worker, and turns out he's a Christian. Well, that's even more. I'd like to know a little bit more about him versus, well, Joe over there, he just seems to be always taking a break and never really too interested in the company, and he doesn't really have good work habits. Your testimony is both verbal and also in terms of lifestyle. So recognize that if you're going to really be effective in terms of evangelism, you're going to have to not only model what you are talking about, but also be able to verbalize it in a way that makes a difference. So that's just another one of those principles in the book that I think people are going to find very helpful. We come back from the break. Let's, if we can, get into a couple of other issues. We talked about maybe the issue of balance in the workplace. We've talked a little bit about how to share the gospel. But how do we handle a difficult boss or a difficult coworker? Or what does it mean to be a Christian boss? Maybe you're in a position of leadership. Can you apply Christian principles of leadership in your work? And there are so many great chapters as well as appendices in this book. And each one of those ends with a for further reflection that gives you some scripture passages as well as some suggested questions. So we think this would be a great book, not only for individual study, but for small group study as well. So we'll get back into some of those practical questions that are addressed in the book. It's published by Zondervan. Look for it in your local bookstore. We also have a link on our website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee has signed into law a measure protecting the religious liberty of Tennessee's student athletes. The new law allows parents to opt their students out of participation in an athletic contest if the event is on an official school holiday, observed day of worship, or religious holiday. Moreover, it sets the authority aright by explaining that school officials may not require a student to attend an athletic event over the parent's objection. Some wonder how necessary such a measure is. They argue that schools already respect the religious choices of student athletes and do not punish those students who, for religious reasons, sit out of scheduled contests. That, I suppose, is a debate for the ages. Whether athletes should participate on holy days is not a new issue. Just watch the classic movie Chariots of Fire as but one example. Nonetheless, it is good to see the state of Tennessee explicitly stating that its school districts should be mindful that there are things to be respected of higher importance than sports. Athletics can teach students much about life, diligence, and teamwork, but life balance is a critical element taught by sports in school as well. Today's student athletes are tomorrow's business leaders who may be required to accommodate the religious practices of employees. Let us hope they learn the delicate balance of freedom well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Sebastian Traeger with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the book, The Gospel at Work, published by Zondervan, and lots of practical chapters, including this one, How Do I Handle Difficult Bosses and Coworkers? Just a minute, we might also talk about what it means to be a Christian boss, but everybody has a story. As a matter of fact, Sebastian, if you just go into a lunchroom at noon or a restaurant at noon, you will hear all sorts of coworkers talking about their boss and how obnoxious he or she is, or one of these coworkers. I mean, it is amazing if you just listen at a restaurant or a cafeteria or something like that, because they spend a fair amount of time talking about these difficult people that we have to work with. And because we have to work with them and we can't leave them unless we leave the job, This is why you've put that chapter in there to begin to help us think through how we begin to address that issue. So give us a couple of pointers.
Sure. And again, it goes without saying, anybody who works anywhere is going to have some level of frustration in the workplace. Why? Because we have to remember, expectations as Christians are, God created work to be a good thing where work and worship are linked together. Because of the fall, God cursed our work, and so our work is never going to live up to the expectations that we want for them. And one of the ways we experience that is just through difficult relationships in the workplace. It's going to happen. I think in this point, we have to start by just remembering that God is the one, again, who assigns us our work. Now, I think that's a very freeing thing to recognize, hey, listen, if I have a difficult boss or a difficult coworker, that's all under God's sovereignty. He knows exactly that that's an assignment that he's given me. It's an assignment actually for my good and my sanctification so that I can grow to be more Christ-like as I recognize what it looks like to submit to authority or work aside people who are difficult. I will say, just as a practical point, and there's other things I can say, but probably for me personally, one of the most helpful things I have done whenever I've had a difficult boss or a difficult coworker is pray for that person regularly. It is incredible when you start to pray for somebody, and don't pray one of those like, God, I pray you change this person to be exactly like I want them to be, but instead literally pray for that person. Pray for them to find joy in the workplace. Pray for them in their family. Pray for them to grow in character. Pray for them to enjoy what they're doing. All these good ways that you start to pray for them, I just think God uses that to really change our hearts as we relate to other people that we find difficult.
The flip side of that is, what does it mean to be a Christian boss? Now, one of the things you quote from is Jim Collins' Good to Great, which, by the way, is a great book that I would recommend. But this requires us then to maybe apply some of these biblical principles about leadership as well as biblical principles about authority.
Yeah, if you're in a position where you are a boss, recognize that the authority that you have is authority that effectively has been given to you by the Lord. And the Lord, who kind of grants you that authority, effectively says, I'm delegating some of my authority to you. What's the purpose of that authority you have? Well, yes, on one level it is to get that widget made or that coffee served or that brief written. Absolutely, there's that functional part. But even bigger than that, you've been delegated that authority so that you can show your coworkers, a watching world, honestly, the angels in heaven, this is what God's authority is like. Watch how I steward authority, because I'm trying to steward it in the same way that God stewards authority. And then we see all kinds of ways biblically that God is kind with authority. He serves and blesses others with his authority, right? He is sacrificial, we see in authority. Obviously, our authority should imitate Christ. We see all these ways biblically that our authority can now image and represent the God who delegates it to us. Just a high challenge, I would say, for any boss. So I just want to encourage you in that if you are a boss.
Let's, if we can, just focus for a second on this idea of calling before we run out of time. And you've got a chapter there on a full-time ministry. Is that more valuable than my job? Or even, am I called to my job? There's this idea, Sebastian, sometimes that, well, there's a calling to ministry, but there's not a calling to our jobs. And that's something that you really address as well in the book.
We do, and this is a topic that I'm passionate about. Obviously, everything in this book, but when we think about calling, I think oftentimes we can think of it as kind of the quote one big thing I'm supposed to do, and really what we want to do is help people see that calling is really a collection of the abilities, the opportunities, the desires, all of these things. Effectively, what you're doing right now is what God has called you to do right now, to exercise your abilities in that assignment for the glory of God. And so to ask the question, well, is full-time ministry more valuable than my job? We'd almost say, well, no, absolutely it's not. Yes, there's a specialness to preaching the gospel and communicating the word, but no, every one of us has an individual assignment that God has given us. And we want to encourage people, rather than constantly thinking, is there a better assignment for me or is that assignment better? We want to encourage people to be faithful in the assignment that God has given them. We think that's the more foundational question, which is, am I being faithful with the responsibilities, with the opportunities, with the abilities, and the desires that the Lord has given me?
So again, just great material in this book. Just before we go, let's talk about how people can use the various chapters as well as the appendices. You have 5 practices to help you live out the gospel at work. We already mentioned a biblical theology of work, as well as some other material that you have in the book on how to leverage your job for the nations. So there's a lot of great material, but just give us an idea of how this might be used in a small group setting if somebody would like to begin to teach that and gather together others to begin to think about how to apply a biblical perspective to their work.
Sure. If you go to our website, thegospelwork.com, there are basically we've taken the book and we've broken it into 6 different units effectively, so that whether you're teaching it in a small group or a Sunday school class, you can effectively lead your church or your group through that and help them think through some of these principles. We think it's great to either hand out the book ahead of time or to encourage people to read that so they come in prepared. We think that's a really useful way to go through it. You can check out our website, thegospelwork.com. The other thing I would say is a lot of people have read this book with one other person or 2 other people. And so we think reading groups is another great way to go through it, where effectively you just each read a chapter or 2. The book is designed to be a pretty quick read. Each chapter is only 10 or 15 minutes of reading, and then there's some discussion questions so that you can really kind of talk it through and think through how you're learning and what you're learning from it.
And again, let me just mention that at the website there, which we have a link to, the various resources, some videos, and other material at thegospelatwork.com. Of course, we also have a link to the International Mission Board, and of course, we have information on our website for this book. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've got it very easy for you to find the link and to use in your study. And I hope that you'll not only read it yourself, but maybe consider putting together a small group to address those issues. So again, Sebastian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View, and thank you for writing the book.
Well, Kerby, it has been a joy. Thank you for such great questions, and I really appreciated the opportunity to share some of these ideas with your audience.
Well, again, outstanding resource. And again, let me encourage you to get a copy of the book, Forward by David Platt, which I quoted from as well, The Gospel at Work, How the Gospel Gives New Purpose and Meaning to Our Jobs. You would spend as much as 80,000 hours at work. Does a Christian viewpoint have any relevance there? Of course it does. And so this is a resource we want to put in your hands. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, and find some of those links, find out some of the resources available. My Viewpoints commentary is there, and so many other resources that I hope you'll take advantage of. And if you appreciate what we're talking about, you can also click on the button that says donate and help us out financially. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. We'll see you back there then.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.